The unexpected encounter. Captain Aiden had been stranded on the barren planet for days, his communications equipment broken and no sign of rescue. He had never expected to end up here, alone on a desolate world far from the safety of his squad. His ship had crashed in a freak storm, and now all he had was his survival training, a few supplies, and his own will to stay alive. The planet's surface was rocky and lifeless, with only harsh winds and dust clouds to keep him company. Aiden had managed to find a small cave to shelter in, but food and water were running low. Every day felt like a fight to stay alive. On the fifth day, just as he was beginning to lose hope, something changed. A flash of light, bright and sudden, shot across the sky. It wasn't like any meteor he had ever seen. This light had a pattern, almost deliberate. Aiden's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle and rushed out of the cave, squinting against the harsh sun as he tried to track the source of the light. It wasn't long before he saw it. A spaceship, large and strange, tumbling out of the sky. The ship was like nothing he had ever seen, with jagged metallic wings and strange markings along its surface. It crashed into the ground with a deafening sound, sending up a massive cloud of dust and debris. Aiden's heart raced. His first thought was that it was some kind of attack, but as the dust settled, he realized something was wrong. The ship wasn't moving. No soldiers, no aliens, no battle noises, just eerie silence. He hesitated for a moment, torn between caution and curiosity. But then, the thought that maybe this could be his ticket off the planet drove him forward. Aiden moved toward the wreckage, his steps careful, every sense on high alert. When he reached the wreck, he saw the full extent of the damage. The ship was nearly torn in half, parts of it scattered across the rocky ground. There were no signs of life at first. He called out, but no response came. Still, Aiden felt something pull him toward the wreckage, something deep within him urging him to check the inside. Maybe there was a survivor. His boots crunched against the gravel as he moved around the ship, looking for a way inside. He found an opening, a gaping hole in the side of the ship where the hull had been torn apart. The smell of burning metal filled the air, and Aiden felt his throat tighten. But he pushed forward, his mission clear. He climbed inside, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The wreck was a maze of broken pieces and twisted metal. He could hear something faint, like a soft, rasping breath. His heart skipped a beat. There was someone, or something, alive inside. Aiden moved cautiously, following the sound of breathing until he reached the cockpit area. And there, lying on the floor, covered in blood and debris, was an alien. The creature looked nothing like the cold, monstrous beings Aiden had seen in his training. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, almost translucent, and her body was slender yet strong, with sharp features. Her hair was silver, long, and tangled. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her eyes barely open, barely alive. Aiden's heart hammered in his chest. He had never seen an alien like this before. She was beautiful, in an otherworldly way, but her life was fading fast. Without thinking, Aiden knelt beside her. He could see that her injuries were severe. Blood pooled around her and her breathing was ragged. The pulse on her neck was weak, barely a thump against his fingers. She was on the edge of death. For a moment, he just stared at her, frozen. His mind raced. This was an alien, a member of a race that had been known to attack humans without warning. But now, she was helpless. She needed help. Aiden's thoughts swirled. He had no idea who or what this alien was, but one thing was clear. If he didn't act quickly, she would die. And something deep within him told him that he couldn't let that happen. Without thinking twice, Aiden ripped open the emergency med kit he carried and began tending to her wounds. He applied pressure to the most serious ones, but it was clear that she needed more than just bandages. She needed blood. Aiden hesitated. He didn't know if his blood would help her or if it would kill her. He didn't know if she would attack him once she regained strength, But he couldn't just leave her to die. There was a moment of silence as he looked down at her, and then, with a deep breath, he made his decision. He would give her his blood. Aiden used his own knife to cut his arm, wincing as it bit into his skin. He held his bleeding arm over the alien's mouth, hoping that it would be enough. Her lips parted slightly, and with great effort, she took a slow, painful breath. The alien's eyes flickered open, staring at him for just a moment before closing again. Aiden felt a strange connection between them in that instant. Was it just his imagination, or did she understand that he was trying to save her? He could only hope. The decision to save her, Aiden's mind raced. The alien woman lay unconscious before him, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Blood dripped from her wounds, staining the jagged metal of the wrecked ship. Her pale blue skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, but it was clear that without help, she would not survive. He ran a hand through his messy hair, sweat trickling down his forehead. Every second mattered. He glanced around, hoping for some miracle, but there was nothing. The storm had passed, but there was no sign of rescue, no signal to call for help. This desolate planet had swallowed him whole, and now it seemed to want to take her too. Aiden's gaze returned to the woman, and his heart clenched. "She's not just some monster," he whispered to himself, trying to convince his own racing thoughts. In his training, they taught him to never show weakness, to trust nothing and no one. Aliens were dangerous. Their race had attacked humanity more times than he could count. But in this moment, as he looked at the life slowly draining from her, those teachings felt far away. What good was following orders if it meant letting someone die right in front of him? He had to make a decision, and fast. The cold reality hit him like a slap across the face. He was alone, and his choices now would determine his survival. He could leave her, let nature take its course, and try to survive on his own. It would be safer, simpler, but Aiden wasn't sure if he could live with that choice. There was something about her that tugged at him, something more than just the immediate danger of being alone. Slowly, Aiden pulled the alien's body closer, trying to stem the flow of blood from her most serious wounds. She groaned softly, her body shuddering, as if reacting to his touch. For a moment, Aiden froze, watching her carefully, unsure if she could even feel him. But then he noticed the faint flicker of her eyes, as if she could sense his presence. "I can't let you die," Aiden said quietly, almost to himself. It was crazy, he knew. Everything about this situation screamed danger. But there was something in her struggle, in the way she clung to life despite the odds, that made Aiden feel like he couldn't just walk away. He looked down at his hands, already stained with her blood, and thought about what needed to happen. Aiden had once read about human blood transfusions in his training, but he had never imagined he'd be in a situation where he would need to use his own blood to save an alien. He didn't even know if it would work. But there was no other choice. Aiden unstrapped his utility belt and took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. His heart pounded in his chest as he prepared himself. He knew he had to act quickly, or she would slip away completely. His fingers trembled as he grabbed a small, sterile needle from his medkit. He wasn't sure how much blood she needed, or if this would even work, but he had no time to waste on doubt. With shaky hands, he carefully found a vein in his arm and inserted the needle. The blood flowed steadily, filling the small bag attached to the kit. He looked at the alien woman again, a strange feeling settling in his stomach. She was barely breathing. And yet, somehow, she had managed to survive the crash. She wasn't human, but there was something about her, something that called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Aiden couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. Perhaps it was foolishness. Perhaps it was the isolation that had clouded his judgment. But the thought of leaving her to die alone, to let her perish in this cold, empty place, felt wrong. He wasn't just saving her out of duty. He was saving her because it was the right thing to do. He gently pressed the needle into the woman's arm, the cool, sterile tube filling with his own blood. As he did, Her body seemed to shudder, almost like a reaction to the foreign substance being introduced. Aiden held his breath, wondering if he was making a mistake. Would his blood cause her harm? Was this the final act of kindness, or the biggest mistake of his life? The seconds stretched on, tense and uncertain. He couldn't look away as the blood slowly entered her body. Then something incredible happened. The alien woman's body jerked slightly. Her fingers twitched, and for the first time since he had found her, her eyes flickered open, though they were unfocused. Aiden froze, staring at her, unsure if he was witnessing a miracle or a deadly transformation. Her eyes, bright, alien eyes, met his, though she seemed to have trouble focusing. Her lips parted, and a soft, raspy sound escaped them. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible. Aiden's heart skipped a beat. She was awake. She was alive. He swallowed hard, trying to think of what to say. But before he could respond, the alien's gaze sharpened. Her body stiffened, her muscles tensing as if preparing for something. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. Aiden held his breath, unsure what was coming next. Would she attack him? Did she think he had betrayed her by giving her his blood? But the moment passed. Instead of lashing out, the alien closed her eyes, her body relaxing slightly. It was as though the blood had reinvigorated her, brought her back from the brink of death. Slowly, she turned her head, a look of gratitude, mixed with confusion, flashing across her features. Aiden let out a long, slow breath. She was alive. She had survived. But the danger wasn't over yet. Now they had to face whatever came next. The blood exchange. The alien's eyes struggled to focus, her breath shallow and uneven. For a brief moment, it felt as if the entire world held its breath. Aiden's heart thudded loudly in his chest, each beat seeming to echo in the quiet wreckage of the ship. He couldn't decide if he was relieved or terrified. Was she truly alive, or was this just another step toward her inevitable death? Her lips parted again, and a soft, guttural sound escaped, like an alien language, unfamiliar and strange. Aiden leaned closer, unsure of what to do next. Her eyes, which had once been distant and glazed with pain, now flickered with something more. Recognition, perhaps. Curiosity. A deep, almost animal-like instinct told him to back away. The moment felt charged with tension, like a delicate balance on the edge of a knife. But the woman's gaze didn't hold malice. It was confused. Her alien face was still etched with pain, but there was something in her eyes, something that seemed to understand him, even if she didn't fully grasp the situation. Aiden, caught in that gaze, felt an odd pull. Despite her injuries, despite the dangerous unknowns that lingered around her, something in him told him he had done the right thing. Then, to his surprise, she moved. A sharp breath escaped her, followed by a weak cough. The blood transfusion had started to work. Her alien body was beginning to accept his blood, though it was clear she was still weak. She tried to lift her hand, but her muscles were too stiff, too broken from the crash. Aiden immediately reached out to help her, his instincts pushing him to act before she could collapse again. "You're alive," Aiden whispered, more to himself than to her. He was almost in disbelief. Could this really be happening? The woman's eyes locked onto his again, her lips parting as if to speak. But the words that came out were incomprehensible. An alien tongue, quick and sharp. Aiden shook his head, not understanding a word, but the tone wasn't hostile. There was desperation in her voice, as if she was trying to communicate something important. "Please, I don't understand," Aiden said, his voice tight with frustration. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind racing. What if she was calling for help? What if this was all part of some elaborate trap? But the woman's body trembled again, and she reached for Aiden with trembling fingers. Her alien features, though strange, held a certain vulnerability now. Aiden could no longer see her as just a threat. She was hurting, just like him, stranded and alone, in a place neither of them understood. Instinctively, Aiden helped her sit up, supporting her with his arm around her shoulders. As he did, he saw the strange markings on her skin, glowing faintly under the dim light of the wreckage. There were patterns, almost like tattoos, but they seemed to shimmer in an unnatural way, as if alive. It was unlike anything Aiden had ever seen. But at that moment, those markings didn't matter. What mattered was that she was breathing, and her pulse, though still weak, was steady. She struggled to sit, her head spinning. Aiden could feel the heat radiating off her, a heat he had not expected from an alien. He tried to steady her, but her movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Aiden placed his hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring touch. "I don't know what you're saying, but you're safe now. We're going to make it through this. I'll make sure you get out of here." He could hear his own voice trembling slightly, unsure whether his words were reaching her. Her gaze softened as she locked eyes with him again. She was clearly struggling to focus, but Aiden could see the flicker of understanding in her expression. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. She wasn't just an enemy anymore. She was someone who had been hurt, just like him, and he had saved her life. For a moment, everything felt still. The world outside, the barren planet, the wreckage, the isolation, seemed to disappear. Aiden wasn't alone anymore. There was another soul, a stranger from the stars, sharing this grim reality with him. But then, without warning, the woman collapsed against him. Her body went limp, and for a terrifying second, Aiden thought he had lost her again. His heart stopped. "No, no, no," he muttered, panic rising in his chest. He caught her before she could hit the floor, lifting her back up. His breath came in quick gasps as he checked for signs of life. Her pulse was still faint, but it was there. Aiden shook his head, cursing under his breath. He had saved her life only for her to slip away again. Was this it? Had he made a mistake by giving her his blood? Was this all just some cruel twist of fate? But as he held her, he realized something. The alien woman's body was healing, slowly but surely. Her skin had stopped paling. The wounds from the crash had started to close, and there was a warmth returning to her form. She wasn't dead. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, she would survive. The silence between them stretched on for a moment. Aiden could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him. He had given her his blood to save her, but what did it mean now? She was alive, but who was she? What did he owe her now? As Aiden tried to steady her again, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. There was a faint, almost imperceptible glow coming from within the alien woman's chest, near her heart. The glow seemed to pulse with a rhythm, synchronized with her heartbeat. Aiden's breath caught. Could this be some sign of life, or something else entirely? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. His blood had done something to her. And the bond between them, strange as it was only just beginning. The alien awakens. The cave was still. Only the sound of Aiden's shallow breath and the distant wind outside filled the space. His hands trembled slightly as he held the alien woman in his arms. Her skin was cooler now, though she still felt unnaturally warm in certain places, almost as though her body was fighting to recover. His pulse raced as he watched her closely, praying for any sign that she would wake up again. For a long time, there was nothing. He checked her pulse, her breathing. Everything was steady, but she remained unconscious, lost to the void of whatever feverish state her body had slipped into. Aiden knew that he couldn't leave her alone. He had already risked so much, and he wouldn't walk away now. It was too late to turn back. But there was something in the silence, something unsettling, as if the wreckage itself was holding its breath along with him. Aiden didn't know if it was his exhaustion from days without sleep, or the strange bond he felt toward this alien woman, but the stillness gnawed at him. Just as he was about to move to the corner of the wreck to grab some water, a soft sound cut through the quiet, the sound of a faint gasp. Aiden froze. His heart leaped into his throat. The alien woman was stirring. Her fingers twitched, Then her eyelids fluttered. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing the strange, iridescent glow within them. They were sharper now, more focused. Aiden could see the confusion in them as they scanned the cave, tracing the walls, the wreckage, and finally, settling on him. She blinked again, her mouth opening slightly as if she were trying to form words. Aiden leaned in, holding his breath. "You're awake," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. He hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly. She had been so close to death just a short time ago. And now she was conscious. The alien's gaze flicked to the med kit beside her, and then back to Aiden, her brow furrowing. Aiden watched her closely, trying to read the expression on her face, but it was hard to make sense of what he saw. There was an intensity in her eyes, an alien fierceness that made his stomach twist, but there was also a flicker of something softer, something unfamiliar. She tried to speak again, her words coming out slow and raspy. Her voice was like music, strange and alien to his ears, but full of power. What did? Aiden's heart raced as he searched for the right words. He couldn't understand her completely, but it was clear she was trying to piece together what had happened. "I gave you blood," Aiden said, his voice quiet but firm. "You were dying. I gave you my blood to save you." The alien woman's expression changed. There was a flash of recognition in her eyes, but it quickly vanished, replaced by a guarded look, as if she were trying to protect herself from something. Aiden felt his chest tighten. He couldn't quite explain why, but the way she looked at him made him feel like an intruder, as if his actions had crossed some unspoken boundary. For a moment, they both remained silent, unsure of what to say next. Then the woman attempted to sit up, her movements slow and cautious. Her muscles trembled from weakness, and she placed her hand on the ground for support, her alien features showing a faint grimace. Aiden moved to help her, instinctively reaching out, but she recoiled slightly, pulling away from his touch. Aiden froze, his heart sinking. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, trying to reassure her. "I'm not going to hurt you. I saved your life." She stared at him, her breathing heavy, but this time, there was something more in her eyes, something that seemed almost human. "Save," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the word itself were foreign to her. Aiden nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy. She was disoriented, confused, likely trying to process everything. He couldn't blame her. He was equally confused by the whole situation. After all, he had never expected to be in this kind of predicament. An alien, one of the enemy species, lying in front of him, saved by his own blood. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "Yeah, I didn't want you to die," Aiden said, his voice steady but gentle. He needed her to understand. "We're not so different, you and me. You were hurt. I helped. That's all." The alien woman's eyes flickered, her gaze shifting as she processed his words. She opened her mouth as if to speak again, but before she could, a soft groan escaped her lips. She pressed her hand to her chest, her face crunching up in pain. Aiden immediately crouched beside her, concerned. "Are you all right?" But she shook her head weakly, her body trembling. "Pain," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked at him again, this time with something new in her eyes, something like gratitude, or perhaps a growing sense of understanding. She didn't trust him yet, but she wasn't afraid of him anymore, either. Aiden hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He had saved her, but there was so much more he didn't understand about her. About them. The world outside this cave was still a vast unknown, and so much was at stake. They were both strangers in this place, but perhaps together they could survive. Maybe even understand each other. But that was a question for later. Right now, all Aiden wanted to do was make sure she was all right. He couldn't leave her alone again, not after everything he'd done, not after everything they had both survived. "Let me help you," he said softly, his hand reaching out to steady her once more. This time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she hesitated for a moment, before slowly, carefully accepting his help. And in that small, tentative act, something began to change between them. The unspoken bond. The alien woman's hand trembled as she pressed it against her chest. Her breath was still shallow, but there was something more in her posture now. It was as though she was slowly regaining her awareness of the world around her. Aiden watched her closely, his heart beating faster, not just from the uncertainty of the moment, but from something deeper, an unsettling connection that he couldn't fully explain. The air in the cave seemed to thicken, charged with a tension neither of them had created but both could feel. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood that this moment, whatever it was a turning point. The woman's eyes flicked to Aiden again, but this time there was a hint of curiosity in them. She was no longer looking at him as though he were a stranger or a threat. There was a strange sense of recognition, like a puzzle piece finally snapping into place. "Who are you?" Her voice, though still weak, was clearer now. It was softer, less distant, though it carried an alien tone that Aiden couldn't quite decipher. It was almost melodic, like a song sung in a language too ancient to grasp. Aiden hesitated, his mind racing. What did she mean by that question? Who was he to her now, after what he had done? Was he a savior? A fool? A mere man in the vast, unforgiving universe? The weight of her words pressed down on him. He cleared his throat, trying to sound confident despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. "I'm Aiden," he said. "I'm human. And you're alive because I gave you my blood. I saved you from dying." The alien woman's eyes widened slightly. She seemed to be processing his words, her gaze flickering between him and the wreckage around them. It was clear that she didn't fully understand everything, but something about the way she looked at him, her expression softening, made Aiden feel like they were starting to bridge a gap between two very different worlds. "I don't know how to." She trailed off, her voice losing its strength as the reality of her situation hit her again. She turned her head slightly, glancing toward the ship's broken hull, her silver hair falling across her face. "My ship, it crashed." Aiden nodded. "I saw it fall. You were in bad shape when I found you. I thought you were dead." He paused, his throat tight as he fought the memory of her lifeless form. "You're lucky I found you." The alien woman turned her gaze back to him, studying his face. It was almost as if she were seeing him for the first time, not as a human or an enemy, but as something different, something that was no longer just part of the vast unknown. "I am Kalara," she said, her voice stronger now, though still tinged with pain. "I am of the Elithar." The name was foreign to him. He had never heard of her species, and yet, the way she said it felt heavy with meaning. "We are travelers. Explorers." Aiden's brow furrowed. "Explorers? What are you looking for?" Kalara's eyes darkened for a brief moment. "Answers," she said quietly. "We have lost everything." Her voice trailed off, and Aiden noticed a deep sorrow in her gaze, an emotion he hadn't expected to see in someone so foreign to him. "The Elithar were a proud race, but we have been scattered. The war took much, and now we are searching." Aiden couldn't help but be drawn in by the sadness in her eyes. She had been through something, a loss that mirrored the scars of his own people, humanity. He knew how it felt to lose everything, to be stranded, to feel alone in the universe. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. I didn't know. I thought you were just another enemy." Kalara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was a flicker of understanding in them, as if she, too, had been shaped by war, by loss. "We are not enemies, Aiden. Not anymore." The word struck Aiden deeply. Not anymore. That one phrase carried so much weight, so much promise. They were different. They were from separate worlds, separate histories. But in that moment, It felt like they shared something more profound, a connection that defied everything they had been taught, everything they had believed. Clara shifted slightly, still struggling with the weakness in her body, but her gaze remained fixed on him. There was a quiet strength in her now, a quiet resilience that made Aiden feel like she was more than just an alien who had crash-landed on his planet. She was someone who had survived, someone who had lost everything, but still managed to rise from the ashes. Aiden stood up and moved toward the small supply crate in the corner, returning with a bottle of water. He opened it and handed it to her. Clara accepted it hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his as she took it, and for a fleeting moment, Aiden could have sworn there was an unspoken understanding between them. She didn't just see him as a human. She saw him as something else, something familiar. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw but sincere. Aiden nodded, though he wasn't sure if she meant it for saving her life or for something else entirely. Whatever it was, it felt different. He didn't know what had just begun between them, but he knew it was something neither of them could turn away from now. The bonds of fate were stronger than they had ever imagined. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of water and soft breathing the only noise between them. Outside, the wind howled across the barren planet, but in the cave for the first time in days, Aiden didn't feel alone. He looked at Clara, the strange, beautiful alien whose life he had saved. And despite the unknowns, the fears, and the dangers ahead, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel on this lonely, forsaken world: hope. And in that moment, he realized that they weren't just two beings from different worlds. They were survivors, together. The silent understanding. The air around them felt heavier now, as if the cave itself was watching, waiting. Clara's gaze lingered on Aiden, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if words were no longer enough to convey the depth of the emotions swirling between them. The crash, the blood transfusion, the survival against impossible odds. They had been through too much to just talk about it casually. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared moment, an unspoken understanding that seemed to bind them in a way neither of them could have predicted. Clara's fingers twitched again, and Aiden noticed the strange shimmering tattoos across her arms, faintly glowing under the dim light of the cave. The markings pulsed, almost as if responding to the rhythm of her heartbeat. He watched them in fascination. There was something ancient about them, something that hinted at a power far beyond anything humanity had ever known. "I can't remember everything," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a strange weariness. "The crash, it shattered everything. My crew, my people, they're gone. She paused, as though trying to find the right words, the right explanation for the pain that seemed to haunt her every movement. "I was alone when I landed here. I was supposed to be a messenger, a guide to find the last of our kind. But I failed." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and Aiden could see the weight of her grief. The Elithar had once been a powerful species, explorers of distant galaxies, and yet now, it seemed, they were reduced to scattered remnants of what they once were. The fragility of Clara's situation hit Aiden harder than he expected. He had been through his own losses, his comrades, his family, his people, but seeing it reflected in her eyes made him realize how little he understood about what she had endured. "You didn't fail," Aiden said quietly, not sure if it was what she needed to hear, but feeling compelled to say it nonetheless. "You're still alive. You're still here. That's something." Clara's lips curled slightly, a sad but knowing smile playing on her face. "I was meant to find the last of the Elithar, to carry our knowledge and history forward. Instead, I've become a survivor. There's nothing left but the remnants of a dream that's already died." Her voice grew quieter, more distant. "I never wanted this. To live alone in the ruins of my people." Aiden took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling heavily in the cave. There was something almost intimate in the way she shared her pain with him. In that moment, he realized just how similar they truly were. His people had faced their own collapse, their own extinction-level events. And yet here they were, two survivors from two different worlds, brought together by circumstance, by an unexpected act of kindness. "You're not alone," Aiden said, his voice firm but gentle. He moved a little closer, closer than he had ever intended, but the moment seemed to demand it. "Not anymore. I'm here." Clara turned her gaze toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. The silence stretched again, this time thick with the unspoken truth that seemed to hang in the air. She wasn't just alone in the world anymore. Neither was he. They were connected, for better or worse, by the strange series of events that had brought them together. And in that shared silence, something changed between them. Clara's lips parted, and for the first time, her voice was steady, carrying a sense of determination that Aiden had not expected. "You saved me," she said, looking him in the eye. "You gave me your blood. My life is in your hands." Aiden felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. The gravity of what he had done was finally sinking in. She was alive because of him, alive because he had made a choice. But the question lingered in the back of his mind. What would happen now? How could he protect her from whatever dangers lay ahead? And more importantly, what did this mean for the both of them? "What will you do now?" Aiden asked quietly, his voice full of the uncertainty that had been haunting him since the moment he found her. "You said you were searching for the last of your people. Is that still your mission? Can you still finish it?" Clara looked down, her expression unreadable as she mulled over his question. She rubbed her arms gently, her fingertips brushing against the glowing markings. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can continue. But—" She lifted her gaze to meet his again, and for the first time, her eyes held something more than sorrow. There was a glimmer of hope in them, faint but undeniable. "I will try. For them. For the Alethar." Aiden nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the future held for them, or if he would ever fully understand her people's history, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away from her now. They had already shared too much. And so, despite the uncertainty that loomed like a shadow over their fragile alliance, Aiden made a promise to himself. He would help her. No matter what it took, he would help Clara find what remained of her people. Together, they would survive. Together, they would face the darkness that loomed ahead. Clara slowly stood, her legs wobbling beneath her as she found her balance. Aiden moved to help, but she gestured for him to stop. Her strength was returning, piece by piece. She was a warrior, even if she didn't fully see it in herself yet. "Let's find them," she said, her voice steady now, with a quiet determination. "Let's see what's left of my people." And in that moment, Aiden knew that their journey was only just beginning. The new beginning. The wind outside howled against the wreckage, a constant reminder of the harsh world they were stranded on. Inside the cave, the atmosphere had shifted once more. This time, it was not filled with uncertainty but something else. Something new. The bond that had quietly formed between Aiden and Clara was now undeniable. They had shared their pain, their vulnerabilities, and in the process, they had begun to understand each other in a way that transcended language and species. Clara's gaze never left the horizon beyond the cave entrance as she absently traced the glowing symbols on her arm. The shimmering tattoos pulsed gently, their faint light casting soft shadows on the cave walls. Aiden watched her, unsure of how to bridge the gap between what they had been, strangers, enemies, and what they were becoming, allies, perhaps even something more. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was filled with unspoken understanding. "I don't know if I can finish my mission," Clara said finally, breaking the stillness. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle fragility to it. "The Alethar are scattered. My crew is gone. My people lost in the chaos. But," she paused, her words heavy with something Aiden couldn't quite place. "Perhaps I was meant to find you." Aiden blinked, surprised. Me. She turned toward him, and there was something raw in her expression, a vulnerability he had not expected to see in the eyes of a warrior. Yes, you. I don't know why, but something tells me that this bond between us means more than just survival. Kalara's voice grew softer, almost tentative. I've seen death. I've watched my people fall apart. But you, her eyes softened, and for the first time, Aiden saw a flicker of something that wasn't pain, fear, or doubt. It was hope. Aiden swallowed hard, his heart racing. The truth was, he had no idea what to say. His whole life had been about surviving, about protecting humanity. But now, with Kalara, it was different. He wasn't just surviving for himself anymore. He was surviving for her too. He was fighting for something that went beyond his people, beyond the world he had known. I'm not sure what comes next, Kalara, Aiden said, his voice low. But if you'll have me, I'll help you. We're in this together now. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Kalara didn't speak immediately, but her eyes softened. She took a hesitant step toward him, closing the distance between them. I don't know where this path will take us, she said, her voice steady now. But for the first time in a long while, I don't feel as alone. Aiden stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest, not out of fear, but something else. A strange pull between them, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. Maybe it was the shared pain, the moments they had spent together fighting for survival, or maybe it was the fact that they were both broken, both searching for meaning in a world that had taken everything from them. I don't think either of us is alone anymore, Aiden said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of their shared experiences settling around them. And in that silence, something shifted, something unspoken but understood. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding, about finding something worth fighting for again. Kalara stepped back and motioned toward the wreckage. We'll need to repair the ship. It's the only way off this planet. But, she paused, her eyes meeting his. I don't want to leave just yet. Aiden raised an eyebrow, surprised. Why? She smiled faintly, a glimmer of warmth in her expression. Because I think I need to understand what it means to live again, Aiden. And maybe we can find that together. Her words were soft, but they carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. There was more to life than surviving. There was more to them than what had brought them together. Kalara was right. It wasn't just about escaping this planet. It was about something deeper. A new beginning, built not on the broken remnants of the past, but on something stronger, something they could build together. Aiden nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. All right. Together then. The wind howled again outside, but this time it felt distant, like a memory of something they had already left behind. In that moment, as they stood together in the ruins of an alien world, Aiden and Kalara knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them, they would face it together. Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as survivors, bound by something that had started with a single act of blood and had grown into something far more powerful. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, both of them knew that they wouldn't have to face it alone.